Welcome to the Basics of Statistical Sampling 1, Sources of Error, with Thomas Römer. This is not a type of tutorial that will help you through an exam, certainly not through one of my exams, but it will give you an overview of what errors you have to deal with when conducting a survey, when doing statistical sampling. So, if you're simply watching this to get through your next exam, you may want to start with the Basics of Statistical Sampling 3, where we will actually start talking about the types of questions that you will be facing in an exam. On the other hand, if you're more generally curious, stay tuned and learn about the sources of error in statistical sampling. The essence of sampling is that we have a population of which we take a subgroup, our sample. The population could be people, but it could also be work pieces that come off a workbench, cars that run out of a production line, fruit flies in your laboratory, anything really that you're interested in. Once we have the sample, we observe it. In business application, we oftentimes survey people. And from those observations, from those answers we get from a survey, we make inference about the sample. And from that, we make an inference about the entire population. Much of the mathematical part that we will deal with in later tutorials concerns this area, how we get from the sample observations to inferences about the entire population. This tutorial deals more with these two aspects, how to sample and what can go wrong with our observations. With this, two types of errors arise. The first one is, do our observations or do the answers we get in surveys represent the sample? And the second one is, do those who answered represent the population? That is, does our sample actually represent the population? Now let's talk about the first type of error. Do the answers represent the sample? In surveys, we sometimes have errors in the answers, which is called the validity. Some questions to ask are, does the respondent understand the question? Does the respondent have the ability to answer? Does the respondent have an incentive to distort the answer? In this context, it's important to distinguish between random and biased errors. Random errors typically would cancel each other out. Some people would over-report, some people would under-report. Biased answers, however, mean that most people have an incentive to either under-report or over-report, which leads to a distorted view. So let's look at some examples. Consider this question. During the last 3 months, how often, on average, would you say has your family been in pecuniary difficulties? Is it necessary to use such stilted language? Will the respondent know what pecuniary difficulties means? But worse perhaps even is, how often on average? There is no average here. Either your family has been once or twice or 3 times or not at all in difficulties, but there is no average on this number. In essence then, the question posed is difficult to understand and essentially nonsensical. Let's look at another example. Do you believe that President Obama will be re-elected or not? What's wrong with this question? Well, unless you believe that President Obama will not run for a second term, for whatever reasons, you should answer this question with yes, because if he runs again for a second term, he will be either re-elected or not. One of those two conditions will obtain. Most likely the intention of the question is, do you believe that President Obama will be re-elected? That's a question you can answer with yes if you think so, or no if you don't think so. It is clear what yes and no means. It is not clear what yes or no means in this question. This may seem obvious, yet I have seen ample examples of that type of questions. Literally, while I was composing the previous slides, a polling agency called me, asking for some news program if I was be willing to answer a few questions. After a few preliminary questions about my demographics, the following question was asked. Are you familiar with the Occupy movement? It's not clear what the purpose of this question is, but most likely it is to check out on my political knowledge of current issues. In other words, the question aims at finding out a bit more about me. Now, the next question was, do you know the goals of the Occupy movement? Suppose I answered no. What does that mean? Could mean no, because I'm not that familiar with the movement. This would be further interesting in characterizing how much I know about politics, which then later would perhaps be used to assess how important my feedback is. But no could also mean because I don't think they have any defined goals. This also could be an interesting answer for the survey if the survey wants to know something about the Occupy movement. Unfortunately, given the way the question was asked, the surveyor will never find out why someone would answer no. So it is not clear what a no means, and most likely the survey results will be fairly useless. The fourth example is a question many of us may have been asked, in particular at a doctor's visit. Turns out most people don't answer questions of that type honestly. They tend to systematically underreport their drinking habits. Similarly, smoking habits or questions about your weight, we all tend to cheat a little bit and underreport. This would lead to a systematic bias. We have an incentive, be it our own pride, our own self-image, we have an incentive to distort the results. Now, the second type of error deals with how we make inferences from the sample towards inferences about the population. In this case, we talk about first the sample frame, which means do all members of the population have a chance to be selected. Let's look at the phone poll that I participated in. The sample frame would be people with telephones. Certainly a huge part of the population, but not all members of the population have a chance to be selected. The selection process, is there a bias? At 11 a.m. in the morning, when the phone call arrived, I would think this biases the respondents to a certain group of people, not necessarily people that are employed 9 to 5. Finally, is there a bias to respond? I imagine a lot of people have no interest in helping a third-rate news show in whatever manner. Personally, I answered this poll because I'm interested in survey design. I suspect, however, that the responses are highly biased towards those people that actually watch that type of news. In essence, then, the news show is designing its news to fit its audience. In the next tutorial, I will give you a very brief overview over different sample designs, and then we'll talk about how to derive inferences from the sample to the entire population.